Hello, so we are here today with Erica Sipes. Where do I begin? She is a phenomenal presence in the world of piano sight reading, but also just of music in general. So she studied with Rebecca Pennies and Nelita True at the Eastman School of Music. So she had tremendous mentors. And so you got your bachelor's and your master's degrees at Eastman. And you also are a cellist, not just pianist, but she made her debut with the Chamber Soloists of San Francisco at age 10. And I could go on and on. You currently live in Roanoke, Virginia. And I've seen that your piano music she wrote project is wonderful. And I recently found the YouTube channel for that. So there's the piano music she wrote. And also, of course, the sight reading Maverick show, which Erica does every Sunday. And I highly, highly, highly recommend to anybody listening that you check that out. It's at 1 o'clock, right?
Yep, 1 o'clock
Yeah.
every Sunday.
1 o'clock EST every Sunday. I've gone back through her replays. So she's over, what, 100
I'm almost
something?
at 100. It's like in June I hit 100. I'm
In
very
June, you
excited.
hit 100. Okay, I was just scrolling through and I thought, I think there's about 100. I highly recommend watching those because, I was just going about my sight reading practice. I promise I'll let you talk, but I was going about my sight reading practice, in various ways. And then I started incorporating her videos into my sight reading. So it's wonderful because she actually has the IMSLP links to the sheet music. And then she will talk a little bit about, I should say, you talk a little bit about your kind of thinking process before you dive into playing the piece in front of the whole world at sight. Um, and so it's really great practice for me and a lot of other people to kind of pretend that we're you at that moment and sight read along with you and follow your advice. And so
Huh.
you can click on the sheet music, open it up, and it's just a tremendous resource that you've provided there. But it's also fun to tune in live. So there's so much we could talk about. We were just discussing before I hit record how much there is we could cover. We could talk for 20 hours.
Yeah.
Uh, and kind of the audacious goal of these interviews is to give you a little crystallized uh, insight. The interviews are called InSights into uh, these great piano teachers' pearls of wisdom, right? Which is a big, lofty goal. But so, Erica, I'm really curious to hear about your piano and your musical journey. So, you had great mentors, you started young. What is it that fueled your initial love for music and piano, and ultimately that you think got you on this track to becoming such a great sight reader?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's great to be here and to see you. I've watched your other interviews, so I'm like, yay, this is fun. Okay. All right. So it really started when I was young, and I'm just one of those people that as soon as I started hearing music, both of my parents were amateur musicians, or I would just say they loved music, and they loved classical music especially. So from birth, they always had classical music playing during dinner. And my mom, we had an upright piano. I grew up in Minnesota when I was really young. And I mean, and my dad played guitar just for fun. He liked flamenco guitar and classical. So, I mean, it was around me all the time. And I distinctly remember when I was about 3 or 4 years old, sitting under the upright while my mom was practicing, and I just thought it was the coolest thing. I was so entranced with it all. And so I remember telling her, I think I was around 4, that I wanted piano lessons. I wanted to play the piano. We were getting ready to move to San Francisco. So she said, well, when we get to San Francisco, I'll be looking for a teacher. So at that point, we'll sign you up too. And that was kind of the start. And I remember walking into my first lesson with a collection that I still have of Walt Disney tunes. And I opened the book up to the Walt Disney, like Mickey Mouse Club theme song. And I remember telling the teacher at age 5, this is what I want to learn first. And he was like, that's nice. We'll get there eventually. Um, in terms of sight reading, because my mom was an amateur, she wanted to work on sight reading herself. So as soon as I was kind of good enough to be able to read notes, sort of, she had me playing duets with her whenever she could, to help not only herself, but also me. So that, I don't know how old I was, 6? Maybe it was right from the beginning. She had me reading duets with her. And at the time I was sometimes grumpy about it and I didn't want to. But I mean, now, of course, I look back and I can't really even tell you how I learned to sight read because I think it was just from doing it from the age when I was learning how to speak words and put together language.
Right.
So to me, it's all one and the same.
Right. And you
So
have in your blog, you talk about the comparison between, learning to read language, learning to read words, and learning to read music. And so, because I wasn't a very good sight reader when I was a kid, I just kind of figured it out and memorized everything and didn't read a lot of music. Uh, I haven't had that experience of just being like, hey, this is something that I grew up doing, but I can relate to that through language, of course, like most of us can. Uh, you actually remember though not being able to sight read well or not, like when
You
you
know,
were
I don't know that I do because the sight reading work started at the same time that I was learning to play piano.
right. So it all just came
I
pretty
think so.
organically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I would say is it's been interesting for me because it's just been part of my life. And then when I went to Eastman, when I got accepted as a graduate student, they asked me if I would teach the piano sight reading course,
Right.
which I had taken as an undergrad. And interestingly enough, when I took the class as my first year piano major, my sight reading got worse for about a year when I
Interesting.
had to take the sight reading class.
Oh, interesting.
So when they asked me to teach it, I was sort of put in this awkward spot where I didn't know that I could teach it because it was so natural for me. And B, I was conflicted because I knew, maybe I shouldn't be saying this publicly, but I knew that, the class as it had been taught to me didn't work for me. So I was grateful that I had kind of like a graduate teaching mentor who was a faculty member. And so I went to him with my concern, and he said, well, you can teach the class any way you want to teach the class,
Wow.
which was terrifying, but it gave me a playground to start thinking about all the things that you're thinking about. So now, ever since that time, which is, I don't know how many years ago, 20, 25 years ago that I taught that class, um, I am perpetually thinking about these things. So, yeah.
So, so you said you're thinking about the same kind of things that I'm thinking about. I think a lot of the people, at least in our piano sight reading community Facebook group, are, have played a lot of piano, have played Beethoven sonatas and Brahms Rhapsody and things like that, but still really struggle with sight reading. Even simple little minuets, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I'd imagine, of course, at Eastman you had phenomenal musicians, right? So because it's such a great school of music, but you were teaching the sight reading class, so you had people kind of in a similar boat
Yeah.
who could play virtuosic ref, I'm sure, but really struggled to improve their sight reading. So I'm interested in what your strategy was. I'm really interested in your, tell us about your angle on the pedagogy for that class, if that's something that we can.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, and this is stuff that you touch on in your videos quite a bit. I think there's a misconception about how we should learn how to sight read. And that misconception, well, there's a couple of them. So some people say that you're born to sight read, and if you're not born to sight read, then good luck. You just won't get any better. And I don't subscribe to that view. I mean, yes, it's true that there are some people that I think naturally have more of a leaning towards being able to do it. But I think that what's missing from the pedagogy of sight reading is that it's not that the solution is not just to keep sight reading more, right? I mean, I think you've even talked about that. You know, there's this idea that, well, if you just do it every day without a strategy, you'll get better. And that doesn't work, I don't think. It might work for some, but I think for others it can get very frustrating. And one of the things I learned, because when I was doing this restructuring of the curriculum for this class, I took a cognitive science class, I took a psychology of education class at the University of Rochester. And one of the things I learned was how debilitating frustration can be in education and in learning something. And so that was one of my key goals in teaching the class, was to find ways of teaching sight reading that didn't lead to this whole idea of, this is impossible, this is frustrating, this isn't fun, I'm discouraged. And so, yeah, so then the question became, so how can we prevent this? So it is to get rid of and debunk that concept of, we'll just keep reading, you'll get better, and come down to have solutions that people can easily apply to their music making that are palatable. And then you put those all together and eventually it improves not only your sight reading, and this is like one of my big soapbox things, all these skills you're teaching in those videos you just put up, and all the things that I try to teach people, which are like 12 different concepts, 12 different skills that go into it, those things would improve your musicality, your musicianship, your piano playing abilities across the board, with your solo playing, ensemble playing, ear training, sight singing. All these skills relate, you know, and so it's not like there are only skills you need for sight reading.
Fascinating. So you mentioned feeling frustrated, discouraged, and when I read through blogs and YouTube videos of, you know, the thousands of people that are working on their sight reading, that word comes up a lot, discouraged. I've noticed that. And in your blog, you talk about how music should be fun, and I think part of the discouragement is that, you know, sight reading by definition traditionally has been basically putting a piece of sheet music up there and playing it as if it were a performance, like it's going to sound about that good, right? Like everything, it's going to be as close to performance level as possible. I want to quote something you said in your untraditional bio. Tell me, so she's got a traditional bio and an untraditional bio on her website. And the untraditional says, tell me that performing is all about perfection and virtuosic madness, and I'll turn and walk away with a sigh. Tell me that it's all about sharing the magic of music and the revelation of an artist's true self, and I'll smile and gladly play for you and with you. It would seem that the discouragement that is often felt when trying to sight read music is pretty closely tied to this feeling that it's supposed to be perfect, right? Like we're trying to recreate the music on the spot, just how the composer intended. So, can you talk about
note perfectly? I mean, I'm sorry, but that's one of the hugest. That's another huge misconception, and it's that misconception comes from teachers. It comes from sight reading exams that are given at graded levels.
Right.
Although I would say that when I've looked at some of the grading criteria for a lot of the exams, they actually don't seek perfection. That's not how they grade them. And so again, it's a misconception. Sight reading is not about reading every note on the page. I can't emphasize that enough.
So yeah, totally. And that's what I love about when the sight reading Maverick, when you're sight reading through music, you're giving us the essence of the piece. So can you explain a little bit about your magic, your secret sauce for how you do that? Because it almost always sounds gorgeous, you know? Somehow it sounds really good, but you'll say later, well, I left out a few notes here, or
a lot of notes sometimes.
Right.
So my secret sauce, I like how you put that. I'm trying to think of where to start. So the first thing is, you know, I just don't have as part of the picture reading all the notes. So it's getting to the essence of what the piece is about. So to me, it's a little bit like, what is it like? I mean, it's like reading, you know, those choose your adventure books. Did you ever have those, or maybe you're too young for those books? Like where you start and then it says, it gives you the option, like go to page 53 if in the story they're going to go down the path on the right, or go, you know, go to page 99 if you go to the path. Anyway, they're really fun, but it's an adventure when you're reading the book, and it's the same. I see sight reading as the same way. So anyway, you're trying to get to the essence of the music, and you're trying to figure out the composer's language as you go. But that doesn't mean you have to play all the notes to do that, you know? And again, tying it back to language, when you're reading a book, like if you're reading a book to, if you have a group of kids at your feet, right? And you're reading this picture book, first of all, they probably can't read the book themselves. You're the only one that has the words in front of you. So when you're trying to tell the story, are you trying to capture every single letter that's on the page? Is that going to effectively deliver the story to the kids so that they giggle and scream with excitement and get surprised and jump up because it's a scary story? No, right? You have to kind of be looking ahead, seeing where the story is going so you can predict and inflect the words in such a way to bring all of that to life, right? And that's what you want to do when you're sight reading. But so you have to understand the words, grammar, and so that's why teaching sight reading has to be approached in a different way, more of a way that deals with language. I mean, that's one huge aspect. You know, it's taking what's on a page and being able to process it as a musical language as opposed to note by note.
Totally, totally.
I
Yeah,
hope that makes sense, you
yeah,
know.
absolutely. That kind of ties back into, uh, how you were saying it doesn't necessarily work to just do it a lot, to just do it a lot. I mean, if because there are so many component skills, right? It's like uh, working on our chords, working on theory, working on playing by feel, working on ear training, just listening to music. All of that goes into being able to read well. It's kind of like if I were to start playing basketball and I just went out there and played a lot without, without working, without a coach or anybody
Yeah,
showing me how to dribble or how to shoot. I just went out there and did it.
yeah.
I probably would get a little better, just because I'm actually trying, but I very quickly hit a max point. And I imagine that, like with your students, I know you offer coaching now, and you taught at in the sight reading course, and so can you give us like a little glimpse into one of your classes? Like how would you how would you go about breaking down this highly complex skill for these highly motivated and highly talented students that you had, who already understood, I'm sure they already understood a lot of theory and they could already play all their scales. What did you have them do besides just do it a lot, for sight
Okay,
reading?
I have to be a little bit honest here. First of all, it was a really long time ago.
Sure.
And so I don't totally remember. And it was like survival mode because I was also a graduate student and had, you know.
Or what would you do today? Or
Oh, well, I can
what
tell you
do you
that,
do?
yeah, because it's evolved. But so
Totally.
what I do is it's a combination of things. So I do things with my students who are working on sight reading, like do games and exercises at the keyboard that you did on your sight reading games. So I was really excited to see that because it's not always addressed, right? So things that have to do with getting comfortable with the topography of the keyboard so that you don't have to look down, right? Because that is just a key. You can't overlook that enough. You cannot look at the keys hardly at all when you're sight reading. Um,
That's
so,
yeah. I point
right,
out to my students, I say, they're like, well, how is, just reaching out and feeling for this hand position going to help me read this Mendelssohn piece? And I say, just go to Sight Reading Maverick, just watch her sight read and watch how little, or I'll sight read for them too. I'm not quite at your level though. So I'll say, okay, Sight Reading Maverick, watch her sight read, a Mendelssohn piece and look at how many times she doesn't look down,
right.
right? I mean, or how little she looks down. Yeah, and
Yeah.
they're pretty blown away. And I can do that to a certain extent, but you're phenomenal at it. So
Well, I've done it so much, in my
yeah,
career because I'm a collaborator. So I'm
yeah,
reading music constantly. So that's
yeah,
just
yeah,
what I
yeah,
have to do. So yeah, so those skills I would add, and this is something I didn't hear as much in your videos yet, but I don't know. But I also incorporate with that kind of practice, practice of audiating. So like when you go down an octave, I make sure the student can actually hear the next note because what I've learned is if you're audiating, which means hearing in your head what you want what you think the next note should be pitch wise, a lot of times I feel like that sound can actually help guide where your hand is going next.
yeah.
And
Nice.
in a more advanced state, like when I'm doing my sight reading Maverick, if it's going well and my brain and ears are all working well together, I'm reading ahead, audiating ahead what's coming, and I can actually catch myself before I play a wrong note because I will hear where my finger is reaching for and go, ooh, no, 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 no. And then I adjust, you know.
Yeah,
So that's another aspect of ear training because a lot of people are freaked out about theory. And I was terrible in theory. I cried in all of my theory exams, you know. So you don't have to be good at theory, but you have to inject, I think, theory work and ear training into your sight reading, like little skill games too. I think that can also help. So that's something I do with my students that they hate, but
I like
important.
that. Like with the sight reading games, the videos, the I like to put the sound afterward so that they're
Yeah.
listening to confirm that they played the right note. But I really, love the idea because yeah, that I do that too. Like, you'll see an easy example is, like something like that, a cadence that happens all the time. Of course, bum bum. You know it's going to sound like an octave before you play it, and your brain. Really, what we're trying to do for people is like break down what happens in those little milliseconds. What is happening in the feedback loop, and then break that down and expand it so they can practice it and get into that flow themselves. So it's like, okay, yeah, actually, it doesn't just feel like an octave. I also know how that's going to sound, and they go together. Yeah,
Yes.
the feel of the octave and the sound of the octave, it all flows as one thing. Yeah,
And
I love
each
that.
key, so in conjunction to another aspect that we work on is just things like simple five finger in any key, and making sure that they're using their ear to guide that process. And then also to just feel comfortable in your hand in that five finger position. Because I think it's important. You talk about anchor notes. You need to feel anchored and connected with the keyboard while you're sight reading instead of having the hot potato like, oh, I played a wrong note. Ah, the
Yeah,
minute you leave the keyboard, you're a little bit at a disadvantage, right?
totally, totally.
So it's learning to keep everything close to the piano.
Yeah,
So
and yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so that kind of five finger work, and that's something new that I've incorporated. It's like scale practice. Tell you the truth, I feel like scales aren't quite as important. That's more of an advanced level sight reading thing. As long as you have confidence moving around into different keys and five finger hand positions, then you can expand them easily, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but then you feel not as abandoned on this vast keyboard.
Right. It seems like so the first level would be to get really comfortable sight reading, with the hands in the five finger position, and then
Yeah.
maybe go to the inversions, that kind of thing, like slowly branch out. I feel like the big chasm, that's important, right? To get that foundation. That's what I wish I had done more as a kid, is just sight reading a lot of music in the five finger positions. Uh, but then there's this chasm, this big gap to go from that level to your level. Well, to maybe not your level, that's a whole other thing, but the ability to sight read on the piano, this vast expanse, that we have that challenge that other musicians don't have, right?
Right,
Like a
right.
flutist.
Their fingers are all in the same place for the
Yeah,
most part. Yeah.
right. So do you actually have your students practice leaps like that, octave leaps, or um,
Yes and
how?
no. It's complex because it depends on
Sure,
each
sure,
student too and where
sure,
they're
sure.
coming from. Like
Yeah,
I use ragtime a lot when we're dealing with
yeah,
wider areas
totally.
and I'm like I said, I'm still trying to figure it out for myself because it is just so complex.
It is.
But one thing I was going to continue on with about the five finger thing is,
Mhm.
I start with pieces in five fingers because, and that don't move in a piece,
Mhm.
because then they know they can just be centered and then they can work on looking at patterns and looking at, oh, what do you call it? Like I call it brush strokes, shapes
Yeah, I like
in
that.
the score so that they're instead of reading C, G, C or G, A, B, C, D, note by note, they just see it goes up, right?
Totally, totally.
So you read the G and then go up. And then it gets more complex. So maybe it looks like a mountain range but because their hands are stable, they're not having to worry about the element of moving. Then once they can do that really easily and they're seeing patterns, which is huge for me too, because that reading in patterns versus note by note is like reading words versus reading words letter by letter. Then I'll have them look at a score that's a little more complex. And it's like, can you see where you would move to a new five finger hand position?
Yeah, yeah,
Because really, that to me, it's if you think in hand positions, you can apply that to any complex music. And that's basically what I'm doing when I'm looking ahead in sight reading. I'm looking for clues like, oh, there, I told you my dog was going to bark. Oh, there's an octave leap coming up, then most likely I'm going to start, are the notes after the octave leap going up or are they going down? If they're going up, I'm probably going to put my thumb on that first note because that'll be more in position, right? Because we have to deal with so many notes. If you don't have a concept of how to find the five finger positions, then you can't put in good fingerings. And if you don't have a on the fly fingering ability to some extent, that it also makes sight reading so much more challenging.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought up fingerings because that
Yeah,
comes up a lot in my own private teaching. A student
yeah.
will be sight reading something and they'll kind of stop and say, I didn't know what finger to use. Or they're working on a piece and they're asking me about fingerings. And the challenge is, it's like the forest for the trees. It's like we it's easy to think that fingering is about one finger on one note. Which one finger should I use on that one note? But actually, you have to stand back and say, how many notes can I gobble up with this hand position?
Yes,
And
yes,
then and
yes.
then the fingering is solved. And that's a tricky thing to to learn, I think. And a teacher has to guide that. Yeah.
But I mean, in my opinion, the more I've thought about this over the years, I realize that is a huge area that I don't think is being addressed.
Right.
Apps in a lot of piano teaching because you've got the music books that have the fingering in them.
Yeah, all the answers are there. And so you're thinking note to note because you're reading one little number at a time.
Or you're reading, a lot of students, I think, read by fingerings.
Right, right. You can tell sometimes. You can tell. They
And
miss the
I mean,
position. Yeah.
that's not to say that fingerings in the music is not good. Yes, it's good if they're well chosen fingerings. And like if I'm reading for the show and there's a fingering, I will usually try it if I need to. Um, and especially if I can tell they're decent fingerings. But what I would challenge teachers possibly to do is in the early stages of teaching a musician, or even if they're an amateur and they've just not gotten this education before, take the time every now and then to either give them a piece and have them put in their own fingerings with the concept of the five finger hand positions, expanded hand positions, chords and fingerings, and work through it with them to help them understand how to finger things and why we do it the way we do. Or if that's too much, just ask a student every once in a while, why do you think the editor put that you should put your third finger on G?
Oh, I like that.
You know,
Yeah.
because I just think there's not enough thought process, and that's not a tool that's being handed enough students.
Having also played and studied cello, which is a one note at a time instrument usually, uh, but you have to have intonation. So you have the challenge. You really have to listen. You have the challenge of constantly having to be in tune. The piano seems to be so accessible. It's not difficult to sound decent, playing just note after note after note. It sounds okay, right? Uh, so I wonder if that's part of the problem too. When you're
That it's almost too accessible,
right, right. With
or too
cello, yeah, you've got one note at a
instantaneous,
time. What? Sorry.
so that it's almost too instantaneous, and you don't have to use your ear if you don't want to.
Yeah, it's instantaneous gratification in a sense.
Mm.
Uh, whereas with cello, each note, I've tried cello. I played violin as a kid, but so each note is really takes a degree of concentration, you know. Uh,
Yeah, if you're doing it well.
right.
I mean, I've seen people, students try to sight read, but again, they're not using their ear.
Okay. Okay. So
And
even
if
though
they're
they have to
not
play in
using it,
tune, the ear may still not be.
and then guess what? It's not in tune.
Sure.
And so they don't learn things as much, like they don't necessarily look on the page and they can't identify, oh, that's a half step, oh, that's a whole step. They're just reading note by note, right? But instead, if you learn to read by interval, then you know that the space between your fingers for a whole step is a lot different than the step between half steps. It's a,
Right.
right? I mean,
Right.
it's the same on piano too with the intervals. I don't know,
Yeah, yeah, totally.
all interconnected.
Yeah, I think that's a whole fascinating topic is training the ear and sight reading simultaneously. Because a common thing out there in piano world is, well, you either play by ear, you're more maybe a jazz pianist, you play by ear and you can't sight read, or you're gospel or whatever. You kind of make things up on the spot and you're great at that. So why do you need to learn to sight read? You just hear it and then you can kind of figure it out. Or you are a reader, right? Um, and in which case, a lot of times, great sight readers aren't so good at playing by ear.
Right.
But what you're describing is a pedagogy where you kind of train both simultaneously,
Yes.
which is fascinating. Yeah, and important.
I mean, I wish I had all the time I wish I had millions more hours in the day like so many of us do, because I really do feel very passionately that I wish I could figure out a curriculum for all instruments, doesn't matter, that does combine all of this and that gets the whole scariness of theory and ear training and all that uh, put aside a little bit, and it's just a blending of everything. I think it would be more encouraging to students because they would really feel like they were making music earlier on. They'd be able to sight read music more easily. Uh, I just think it would be transformative, but I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, so here in the group, Marilyn Lowe is a
Yes,
wonderful piano pedagogue, and she has the music moves for piano, which stresses and emphasizes audiation from early
exactly.
on, right? And then
Yep,
she does sight reading a little later, after the student can really internalize and audiate the music,
absolutely.
um, which is yeah, it's incredible, because that's more like how we learn language originally.
Yeah, and I know, that's the Gordon method that I think
Hmm.
Piano Moves is based on. And I did a lot of study of that quite a while ago because it fascinated me. That was at the beginning of my journey of trying to process all this. They talk a lot about um, audiating and learning patterns in music making. And I've seen
Right, right. The
message a little bit,
patterns, patterns.
patterns.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
And so that's another kind of going way back to earlier in our discussion about what I work on with my students. That's another portion of our lessons that we have together is then, after we do some of those games and exercises, I will always have assigned to them a sight reading piece to look at, like 2 or 3 lines long. And I have them just look at the music day after day. They always find something new another day to look for patterns that are repeated. They look for scales. They look for broken chords because a lot of times they don't even see those. again, they're just seeing note by note. So I
Right.
just tell them to look for anything they can find and talk to me about in the music.
Cool.
Um,
Cool.
and we spend like 20, 30 minutes, sometimes in an hour-long lesson, just doing
Wow.
that. And
Your
then
parent,
playing, you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Your
Um,
students are very lucky.
well,
They're
I don't
very
know.
fortunate.
I think they get kind of tired because they feel like it's a lot of work,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
it's different work. And that type of work doesn't feel, because they're not getting that instant oral gratification. I
Right.
think sometimes it's like, and it's
Yeah.
hard to talk about music, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's okay. I'm stubborn.
Well, it's great. I mean, so a good exercise also might be, they're looking at a piece of sheet music and you play what, they're not looking at what you play, but you play one little measure from that music and they have to find it and point to it or something like that. So that,
Ah, I hadn't thought of that.
yeah, I
Yeah.
hadn't either, but that just popped into my brain when you were describing, connecting, seeing the music and hearing it. Also, of course, like listening to performances with the score, going to Sight Reading Maverick, clicking on the link, listening to you read it, following the score, all
Yeah.
that stuff is useful.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Great.
I would say, when you're reading, something to keep in mind when you're sight reading too is, each composer has their own harmonic language and pattern language. And the same goes for composers of different eras. So sight reading something that's more contemporary might be a little different if you haven't heard a lot of that, era music. I mean, you just have to be easy on yourself. Like there's sometimes things on the show that get requested by composers I've never heard of, especially like French music. I'm terrible at French music because I just don't get the harmonic language as well and it doesn't fit in my fingers as well. So I struggle, but I just joke about it and I'm like, oh, well, somebody requested a Ravel piece today. Just great. But it's important to also realize it's all a journey and I keep trying and trying to learn more about the patterns so that I too get better.
Love it. Love it. Yeah. So you've been doing this for, I don't know, a couple of years, the Sight Reading Maverick?
I started it at the kind of the beginning of the pandemic because I just needed
Cool.
something to do.
Yeah, it's like you're you're the Sight Reading Maverick. You're pioneering in the way. I mean, you're driving forward, and no matter what somebody requests, you're up for it. Ravel, I mean, yeah. So you're a great inspiration to everybody in the group. I think to just keep on learning and exploring these different uh, composers' languages because some of us we can get really good at sight reading Mozart. Yeah, but that's all we ever sight read because Bartok or yeah Ravel or Debussy. So that's another thing I love about the show is that you do so many different styles. Uh, yeah. So thanks, Erica. This has been fun. Uh, is there anything else that you'd like to share? If it's okay with you, I'm gonna drop links to your blog, which I highly recommend, and also your YouTube channel, The Sight Reading Maverick, and the music she wrote.
Yeah, that would be great. And for people that are interested, I think on my blog there's still a tab that pertains to just sight reading.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
And I think on that first page that it actually, I think, has I wrote a paper when I was putting together the curriculum for sight reading at Eastman.
Perfect.
I had to submit a big paper and proposal, and that's there. I mean, I've changed my attitude a little bit, but it has kind of the root and the basis of what I've built.
Okay,
My
great.
ideas about teaching sight reading and all that. But um, yeah, I
Excellent.
think there's only one other thing. I wrote down a couple things. I was like, what would I really want to say to people?
Please.
And this is kind of an odd thing, and I think you've touched on it, David, with some of your games, like when you're talking about chunks and patterns and chords and stuff. And I don't know. One of the biggest tools I use with my students is to help them see spots in music that you can play by just blocking them. So, like, if you have a sonatina, like, I don't know, I'm terrible at making stuff up, but left hand could be perceived as being complex and notey, right? But
Right.
it's really just this.
Right.
So I actually ask my students a lot. I'll say, no, I don't want you to play it as written because then it automatically launches them into note reading mode.
Totally.
So I make them, whoops, you know? So
Nice.
I employ blocking all the time in my, when I'm practicing, sight reading, all of that. It just
Yeah.
means your hand is going for the chord and you're not, so you can think ahead, look ahead better. But
Love it.
blocking is one of my favorite techniques out there. So
Great. Thank you.
yeah,
Thanks so much.
yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, yeah, so blocking and chunking, if anybody's curious, are basically the same thing,
yeah,
right? That's blocking, chunking, right? Playing uh, basically all the notes within a given beat or measure at the same time, basically.
exactly. If they're within the same harmony, I think people get
Yes.
confused sometimes because then if they say, oh, but it sounds bad. Then I'm like, well, no, then maybe you need to block in a smaller metrical unit, or that.
Yeah. So that'll also simultaneously help them to start recognizing chords and harmonies and yeah, totally.
Exactly,
Great.
exactly.
Great.
So, oh, and there was one more thing I would just say, and this goes back to what we said at the very beginning. I just want to stress that I think this needs to be practiced. People should feel like as they're working on sight reading that they don't have to play all the notes. So like when you do your blue note thing, I think that's fine to have the goal to be to play all the notes. But I think it's really hard for people to let go and to say, okay, I'm in red mode now. Or like that's because that's what I am in my sight reading show. And
Right.
it is okay to leave notes out. But I think people don't even sometimes know how to do that. So
Yeah.
that's another thing in my lessons with people, and it makes them really mad. I say, I need you to play for me a
Uh,
simplified version of this little exercise. So, what are the things that you could leave out? And there's sort of a formula. So,
what's the
and
formula? What's the formula?
I mean, it's things like you have to know what the most important thing is. So, okay, you don't leave out the melody ever. So, if worse comes to worse, you drop out the accompaniment, or you play the first note of the left hand of each measure while you play the melody. Yes. Okay. If there's an ornament, forget the ornament. Same with grace notes. Forget the grace note. Drop them. But everybody gets stuck on those, right? They get stuck on them and they're like, ah, and then they lose the pulse. If there's a funky rhythm, they tend to get tied up. Or like if you have a fancy like, well, that's the grace note thing, so that doesn't count.
Yeah.
What else? It's just finding what the most important things are. Um, if you have a contrapuntal work where you've got a lot of imitative things going on,
Yeah.
like that, like an invention, I always focus on the beginning of the statement of the melody and then forget the other,
Sure, sure, right.
right? Because again, that's getting to the gist of what the piece is about. It's about that imitative voice thing.
Totally.
I don't know, stuff like that.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And yeah, so that your show is a really great example of what I call red mode. Just because I don't know, it's one of my students was joking. It's like the Matrix. They have the blue pill and the red pill in the Matrix.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
If you're familiar with that. And so, but yeah, so it's just kind of language that popped up from teaching it, and we wanted colors and stuff. And the red mode is basically where we prioritize the pulse and the beat, which is more kind of traditionally what people would call sight reading, right? And you have to leave out notes. Yeah, totally. And so people get a little confused when they're doing blue mode, and it's actually we're prioritizing note accuracy, not the pulse, not the steady beat. They're like, well, if I go from blue mode to red mode, you just wanted me to practice all the notes. Now you're telling me I can leave them out. And I'm like, yeah, I understand the confusion, but basically we're prioritizing note accuracy because that's enough of a challenge. And then we're prioritizing the pulse because that's enough of a challenge. And eventually they kind of come together,
Yeah.
but you can still leave notes out. So this thinking about the essence of what is the music trying to express
Yeah.
is kind of the key to red mode.
Yes, and like you said, like pulse is also just really important. And that's I forgot to say too, like that's a huge component of what I work on with my students. So most of them come to me and refuse to count out loud and they say they can't count out loud. You
Right.
know, they say, "Well, I'm tapping my toe." And I say, "That's not good enough. You really have to be able to count out loud." And they say, "Why?" Well, it's kind of like the forest through the trees thing. If you're able to count out loud, there's a difference between all those different beats. Beat one is the primary important beat, especially for sight reading. But if you're just tapping your toe and you're sight reading, there's so much going on, you might not necessarily have that toe tap, has no clue where the downbeat is. So if
Right.
you get stuck, that toe tapping is really not going to help a whole lot.
Right.
Whereas if you're learning to count in your head, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, if you start getting tangled up in the measure, you still have that one that you're going to come in at the downbeat of the next measure.
Yeah, totally.
But that's
So,
also another skill.
yeah, so the kind of the way to master red mode, or the ability to really sight read music in the traditional way, is to work on a strong pulse, especially on the downbeat of each measure,
Absolutely.
and to look for patterns and chunk and block, and also to kind of scan over the score and think, okay, what are the most important notes? What are the where's the melody? You know, what's the bass doing? And what can I leave out if I need to?
It's a lot, David.
That's why we're here. Thanks, Erica. This has been incredibly, I think, informative and inspiring for whoever's watching. So it's been great to chat with you. Check out her Sight
16.
Reading Maverick, 1 o'clock Eastern Time Sundays, and check out her blog. And I'll put links to both in the video below the video. So,
Yay. Well, thanks. It's been great.
and your dog only barked once, so
Not bad, right?
made the presence known, but she wasn't a problem. So,
I think he'll get a treat.
he,
Yeah.
yeah, I think he deserves a treat. Oh, and can I also put your Twitter handle? Is
Of
that?
course. I mean, if people like I will go on long little threads about sight reading thoughts or thoughts about practicing or
Cool.
music education. I am rambling on and on there all the time. So
Perfect. Yeah, so we would love more Erica ramblings. And I just thought of the Twitter after we had discussed her dog, because she told me earlier that her dog is maybe more famous than she is on Twitter because of the sing-alongs that her dog does so you
yeah,
accompany your dog basically.
basically, well, that's how he likes to think of it. Yes.
The golden doodle. Yeah.
Yes.
So I can't wait to look at those. All right, Erica, thank you so much.
My pleasure.